Sometimes the worst night of your life leads to the most unexpected blessing. Maya Chen thought she knew what rock bottom felt like until that October evening when everything she believed about safety, trust, and human kindness shattered in a single moment. What she didn't know was that across town, a stranger named David was making a decision that would change both their lives forever. This isn't just another survival story. This is about what happens after survival, when the real journey begins. When a woman who had lost faith in humanity meets a man who still believes in second chances. When sanctuary isn't just a place, but a choice someone makes to open their door to a stranger's pain. Maya's story began with betrayal, but it didn't end there. Sometimes the most broken people find each other at exactly the right moment, and sometimes healing looks nothing like what you expected it would. Maya Chen had always prided herself on reading people well. Growing up in a household where silence often spoke louder than words, she had learned to notice the small things, the way someone's jaw tensed when they were lying, how their eyes would dart away when hiding something important. It was a skill that had served her well in her job as a social worker, helping her connect with troubled teenagers who trusted no one. But, on that cold October night, all her instincts had failed her completely. The evening had started like any other Friday. Maya finished her paperwork at the community center where she worked, helping kids from broken homes find their way back to stability. She loved her job, even when it drained her emotionally. There was something deeply satisfying about being the person who showed up when everyone else had given up. At 28, she had built a quiet but meaningful life for herself in the small city of Millbrook. She had her own apartment, a reliable car, and a small circle of friends who understood her dedication to her work. Marcus had been in her life for 8 months. They had met at a coffee shop near her office, where he was reading a book about sustainable architecture. She was immediately drawn to his thoughtful demeanor and the way he listened when she talked about her work. He seemed genuinely interested in making the world a better place, which resonated with her own values. Their relationship had progressed slowly and steadily. He was patient when she had to cancel dates because of work emergencies, supportive when she came home exhausted from difficult cases, and always seemed to say exactly the right thing when she doubted herself. That Friday, Marcus had suggested they try the new Thai restaurant downtown. Maya was tired, but she had been looking forward to spending time with him all week. She had been working on a particularly challenging case involving a 15-year-old girl whose home situation was deteriorating rapidly, and she needed the distraction. Marcus picked her up at 7, bringing her favorite flowers, white tulips, and complimenting her on the blue dress she had bought specifically for their evening out. The restaurant was cozy and dimly lit, with soft music playing in the background. They ordered pad thai and green curry, sharing stories about their week over glasses of wine. Marcus seemed more attentive than usual, asking detailed questions about her cases and listening intently to her responses. Maya felt herself relaxing for the first time in days, grateful to have someone who genuinely cared about the work that consumed so much of her energy. After dinner, Marcus suggested they take a drive to the overlook on the outskirts of town. It was a spot where teenagers often went to be alone, but at night it offered a beautiful view of the city lights spread out below. Maya agreed, thinking it would be romantic to end their evening somewhere peaceful and private. She trusted Marcus completely. He had never given her any reason not to. The overlook was deserted when they arrived, just as Marcus had predicted. He parked facing the view and turned off the engine. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out at the twinkling lights below. Maya was thinking about how lucky she felt to have found someone who understood her need to make a difference in the world, someone who supported her passion for helping others even when it meant their time together sometimes took second priority. That was when everything changed. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a small plastic bag containing what looked like pills. Maya's heart immediately began to race, not with excitement but with fear. She had seen enough drug cases in her work to recognize the signs, but she had never suspected Marcus of being involved with anything like this. When she asked him what they were, his entire demeanor shifted. The gentle, thoughtful man she had been dating disappeared, replaced by someone cold and calculating. He told her the pills were a new type of synthetic drug that was becoming popular at clubs in the city. He said he had been selling them for months, using the money to fund his real passion, traveling to exotic locations and living a lifestyle far beyond what his job as a junior architect could support. Maya felt like she was listening to a stranger. This wasn't the man who had held her hand through difficult conversations about her work, who had brought her soup when she was sick, who had talked about wanting to design affordable housing for low-income families. When Maya said she wanted to go home immediately, Marcus laughed. It was a sound she had never heard from him before, harsh and completely without warmth. He told her she wasn't going anywhere until she agreed to help him expand his operation. He had been watching her work, studying the teenagers she counseled, and he wanted her to introduce the drugs into the community center. He said troubled kids were the perfect market. They were already dealing with pain and looking for ways to escape, and they had access to younger siblings and friends who would become future customers. Maya's blood ran cold as she realized the full scope of what Marcus was asking. He wasn't just revealing that he was a drug dealer, he was asking her to become one too. He wanted her to betray everything she stood for, to poison the very kids she had dedicated her life to helping. When she refused, his response was swift and terrifying. Marcus grabbed her wrist with a grip that immediately left bruises. He told her she didn't have a choice. He had been taking photos of her apartment, her car, her daily routines. He knew where she worked, where she shopped, where she went to church on Sundays. He had been planning this conversation for weeks, maybe months. If she didn't agree to help him, he would make sure everyone she cared about suffered the consequences. The next 20 minutes felt like hours. Marcus detailed exactly how he would destroy her life if she didn't comply. He would plant drugs in her apartment and call the police anonymously. He would send fabricated evidence to her supervisor suggesting she was inappropriate with the teenagers she counseled. He would ruin her reputation so thoroughly that she would never work with vulnerable populations again. But, most chillingly, he threatened the kids themselves. He knew their names, their addresses, their families. He would find ways to hurt them if Maya didn't become his partner in expanding his drug network. Maya tried reasoning with him, appealing to what she thought she had seen in him during their months together. She reminded him of conversations they had had about making the world better, about the responsibility that came with having advantages others didn't have. But it became clear that everything she thought she knew about Marcus had been carefully constructed lies. He had been studying her from the beginning, learning what she cared about so he could eventually use it against her. When Marcus finally started the car to take her home, Maya's mind was racing. She couldn't agree to what he was asking. It went against everything she believed in and would destroy the lives of kids who were already struggling. But she also couldn't see a way out that wouldn't result in terrible consequences for the people she was trying to protect. Marcus had planned this carefully, and he seemed to have thought of every angle. As they drove back toward her apartment, Maya felt more alone than she ever had in her life. The man sitting next to her, who had kissed her goodbye just that morning, was now threatening everything she held dear. She couldn't go to the police without evidence, and Marcus had made it clear that any attempt to expose him would result in immediate retaliation against innocent people. She couldn't quit her job and disappear without abandoning the kids who depended on her. She felt trapped in a nightmare that had no visible exit. When Marcus pulled up in front of her building, he gave her 48 hours to make her decision. He would contact her Sunday night to get her answer. As Maya walked up the stairs to her apartment on shaking legs, she realized that the life she had built so carefully was crumbling around her. She had always been the person others turned to for help, the one with solutions and resources. Now she was the one who needed saving, and she had no idea where to turn. Maya spent that weekend in a fog of fear and desperation. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate on anything except the impossible choice Marcus had given her. She considered calling in sick on Monday, but realized that would only delay the inevitable. She had to find a solution, and she had to find it fast. The kids she worked with were counting on her to protect them, even though they didn't know they needed protection. By Sunday evening, Maya had made a decision that terrified her but felt like the only option she had left. She wasn't going to give Marcus what he wanted, no matter what the consequences might be. But she also wasn't going to wait passively for him to follow through on his threats. She was going to disappear. Maya's plan was desperate and hastily thrown together, but it was the only way she could see to protect both herself and the teenagers she worked with. She would withdraw what little money she had in savings, pack only what she could carry, and leave Millbrook before Marcus expected her answer. She had no destination in mind and no idea how she would survive once her money ran out, but staying meant either becoming complicit in destroying young lives or watching Marcus follow through on his threats against innocent people. Sunday night came too soon. Maya had spent the day going through her belongings, choosing what she could fit in a single backpack. She took her important documents, a few changes of clothes, her laptop, and the small amount of cash she kept for emergencies. Everything else, the furniture she had saved for months to buy, the photos that documented happier times, the books that had gotten her through college, would have to stay behind. At exactly 9 o'clock, her phone rang. Marcus's voice was cheerful and casual, as if he were calling to plan another romantic dinner rather than to receive her answer about becoming a drug dealer. When Maya told him she needed more time to think, his tone immediately hardened. He reminded her that 48 hours had been generous, and that every moment she delayed put more people at risk. He would give her until midnight to call him back with her decision. Those 3 hours felt both endless and impossibly short. Maya sat in her apartment, looking around at the life she was about to abandon, wondering if she was making the right choice or simply trading one nightmare for another. At 11:45, she turned off her phone, shouldered her backpack, and walked out of her apartment for the last time. She left her keys on the kitchen counter and pulled the door closed behind her, knowing she could never come back. Maya's car was parked in the alley behind her building. She had deliberately avoided the main street, afraid Marcus might be watching. As she drove out of Millbrook in the middle of the night, she felt like she was leaving more than just a place. She was leaving behind the person she had been, the identity she had built, the sense of purpose that had guided her for years. She had no idea who she would become or where she would go, but she knew she couldn't stay. For the next 6 weeks, Maya lived like a ghost. She drove from town to town, never staying anywhere long enough to establish patterns or form connections. She slept in her car when the weather allowed, stayed in cheap motels when it didn't, and survived on fast food and whatever she could afford at grocery stores. She used her laptop to search for news about Millbrook, terrified she would see reports of teenagers being hurt or arrested, evidence that Marcus had followed through on his threats despite her disappearance. The isolation was almost unbearable. Maya had never realized how much of her identity was tied to her work and her community until she was cut off from both. She couldn't use her real name, couldn't apply for jobs in her field, couldn't call the friends who were probably worried sick about her sudden disappearance. She existed in a strange limbo, alive but not really living, safe but utterly alone. By early December, Maya's money was nearly gone. The car that had been her lifeline was making concerning noises, and the approaching winter made sleeping outdoors increasingly dangerous. She found herself in a small town called Cedar Falls, about 300 miles from Millbrook, trying to figure out her next move. She had been surviving on part-time cash jobs, cleaning houses, helping with inventory at small stores, anything that didn't require background checks or references. But none of these jobs paid enough to cover rent and food, and Maya was beginning to face the terrifying reality that her escape might have simply exchanged one form of destruction for another. It was in Cedar Falls that Maya first saw David Richardson. She was sitting in the public library, using their free internet to search for job opportunities, when she noticed him helping an elderly man figure out how to use the computer catalog. David was patient and kind, explaining the same steps multiple times without showing any irritation when the man forgot what he had just learned. There was something about the gentle way he interacted with someone who clearly needed extra help that reminded Maya of why she had chosen social work in the first place. David appeared to be in his mid-30s, with prematurely gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He was dressed simply but neatly, and Maya noticed he seemed to know several of the library regulars by name. Over the course of several days, Maya found herself observing him from across the reading room. He seemed to have a gift for making people feel comfortable, whether he was helping children find books for school reports or listening patiently to lonely seniors who clearly came to the library more for human contact than for reading material. Maya learned from overheard conversations that David was a high school English teacher who volunteered at the library on his free time. He lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town, had never been married, and spent most of his spare time either at the library or working in his garden. The librarians clearly adored him, often asking his opinion about book recommendations or community programs. He seemed like exactly the kind of person Maya would have been friends with in her former life, but now the distance between who she had been and who she was forced to be felt insurmountable. Maya's situation became critical just before Christmas. Her car finally broke down completely, leaving her stranded with no means of transportation and no money for repairs. The mechanic who examined it told her the engine was beyond saving, worth less than the cost of fixing it. Maya found herself standing in the parking lot of the repair shop, holding everything she owned in a single backpack, with less than $50 to her name and no idea what to do next. That evening, as snow began to fall and the temperature dropped below freezing, Maya was walking through the residential area of Cedar Falls, looking for somewhere warm to spend the night. She passed David's house, recognizing his car in the driveway, and noticed that every window glowed with warm yellow light. Through the front window, she could see him sitting at a kitchen table, grading papers. It looked so peaceful and normal that Maya felt tears freezing on her cheeks as she realized how far she had fallen from that kind of simple contentment. Maya spent that night in the waiting room of the hospital emergency department, pretending to wait for someone who never came. She dozed fitfully in the uncomfortable plastic chairs, waking whenever security guards made their rounds, always afraid they would ask questions she couldn't answer. As dawn broke on what she realized was Christmas Eve, Maya made a decision that scared her almost as much as Marcus's threats had. She was going to ask David for help. Maya had never begged for anything in her life. She had always been the person offering help, not the one needing it. But pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She waited outside the library until David arrived that morning, then approached him as he was unlocking the door. Her hands were shaking from cold and nerves as she introduced herself, using the fake name she had been living under for weeks. David's first response was concern, not suspicion. He immediately noticed that Maya looked like she hadn't slept or eaten properly in days. When she asked if there were any local organizations that helped people in temporary difficult situations, he didn't just give her a list of phone numbers. He invited her inside where it was warm, made her a cup of coffee from the library's small break room, and sat down to really listen to what she needed. Maya had prepared a story about being in town temporarily for a job that had fallen through, leaving her stranded without resources. It was partially true, even if it omitted the larger context of why she was really running. David listened without judgment, asking practical questions about her immediate needs rather than prying into details that were clearly painful for her to discuss. By the end of their conversation, he had made several phone calls on her behalf and arranged for her to speak with the director of a local homeless shelter the next morning. But David didn't stop there. When he learned that Maya had nowhere to stay that night and that the shelter was full until after the holidays, he made an offer that shocked her. He had a small guest room in his house that wasn't being used for anything important. If Maya was comfortable with the arrangement, she was welcome to stay there temporarily while she got back on her feet. He asked for nothing in return except that she help him understand what resources the community needed to better support people in similar situations. Maya's first instinct was to refuse. She had spent weeks avoiding exactly this kind of situation, afraid that getting close to anyone would put them at risk if Marcus somehow tracked her down. But the alternative was spending Christmas Eve on the streets in a snowstorm, and Maya realized she had reached the limits of what she could endure alone. Against every instinct that had kept her alive for the past 6 weeks, she accepted David's offer. That evening, as Maya sat in David's warm kitchen eating the first real meal she had had in days, she found herself crying for the first time since she had left Millbrook. The tears came without warning, triggered not by sadness but by the simple kindness of being offered food and shelter by someone who owed her nothing. David didn't ask questions or try to fix whatever was making her cry. He simply handed her a box of tissues and sat quietly until the tears stopped, then asked if she wanted seconds of the homemade soup he had prepared. Living in David's house was unlike anything Maya had experienced during her weeks on the run. For the first time since leaving Millbrook, she felt truly safe. David never pressed her for details about her situation, never made her feel like a burden, and never suggested that his kindness came with hidden expectations. He simply treated her like a person who deserved basic dignity and respect, which felt revolutionary after months of living in constant fear. The guest room David had offered was small but comfortable, with a window that looked out onto his carefully tended garden. Even in winter, Maya could see the evidence of the care he put into the space: neat raised beds covered with protective mulch, bird feeders that attracted cardinals and blue jays, a small greenhouse where he grew herbs year-round. Everything about David's home reflected the same quiet thoughtfulness Maya had observed in his interactions at the library. During Maya's first week in the house, she and David established a routine that felt natural rather than forced. David left early for his teaching job, giving Maya privacy and space to begin each day without feeling observed or judged. In the evenings, they often found themselves in the kitchen together, David preparing simple but nourishing meals, Maya helping with dishes or other small tasks that made her feel useful rather than merely dependent. Their conversations during these shared meals became one of the highlights of Maya's day. David was an excellent listener, with a gift for asking questions that helped Maya think through her situation without feeling interrogated. He never pushed for information she wasn't ready to share, but he made it clear that he was available to talk whenever she needed someone to listen. Slowly, carefully, Maya began to open up about her work with teenagers, her passion for helping young people navigate difficult circumstances, and her grief over having to leave that life behind. Maya was surprised to discover how much she and David had in common. He had chosen teaching for many of the same reasons she had chosen social work: a desire to make a positive difference in the lives of young people who often felt forgotten or dismissed by adults. His stories about challenging students who had eventually found their way resonated deeply with Maya's own experiences. For the first time in months, she felt like she was talking to someone who truly understood the work that had defined so much of her identity. As January progressed, Maya began to venture out into Cedar Falls during the day while David was at school. She volunteered at the local food bank, helped organize donations at the library, and gradually became familiar with the community David had made his home. She was careful to maintain the fictional identity she had created, but she found herself genuinely caring about the people she met and the problems she observed. The town had many of the same challenges she had worked on in Millbrook: teenagers struggling with family instability, elderly residents who were isolated and lonely, families dealing with economic hardship. David noticed Maya's natural ability to connect with people who were struggling, and he began asking her opinion about students he was worried about or community issues the school was trying to address. Maya found herself offering insights and suggestions that came from her professional training, carefully framing her knowledge as intuition or common sense rather than formal expertise. It felt good to be useful again, to have her thoughts and ideas valued, even if she couldn't fully explain where her understanding came from. One evening in late January, Maya overheard David on the phone with his sister, who lived in another state. His sister was going through a difficult divorce and was worried about how the upheaval was affecting her teenage daughter. David listened patiently to his sister's concerns, offered gentle suggestions about resources that might help, and promised to research adolescent counseling services in her area. After he hung up, Maya found herself offering specific advice about how teenagers typically respond to family crisis and what kind of support tends to be most effective. David was struck by the specificity and thoughtfulness of Maya's suggestions. He asked where she had learned so much about helping young people in crisis. Maya's carefully constructed story began to crack under the weight of her genuine desire to help. She found herself admitting that she had professional experience working with teenagers, though she couldn't explain why she was no longer doing that work. David didn't push for more details, but Maya could see that he was beginning to understand her situation was more complicated than she had initially indicated. The breakthrough came in early February, when Maya received devastating news that forced her to confront the reality she had been running from. Using David's computer to search for updates from Millbrook, Maya discovered that 3 teenagers from her former caseload had been arrested on drug charges. The local newspaper reported that they had been caught selling a new synthetic drug at their high school, and that police suspected they were part of a larger distribution network targeting minors. Maya realized immediately what had happened. Marcus had followed through on his threats, using her disappearance as an opportunity to recruit the very kids she had tried to protect by leaving. Her sacrifice had been meaningless, worse than meaningless, because her absence had made it easier for Marcus to approach vulnerable teenagers who had trusted and relied on her. The three kids who had been arrested were all ones Maya had worked with closely, young people who had made tremendous progress in stabilizing their lives before she disappeared. David found Maya sobbing in his kitchen that evening, surrounded by printed news articles about the arrests. For the first time since she had appeared at the library asking for help, Maya looked truly broken. David didn't ask questions, he simply sat beside her and waited until she was ready to talk. When Maya finally began to speak, the whole story came pouring out. She told David about Marcus, about the threats, about her impossible choice between becoming complicit in harming children or watching him destroy everything she cared about. David listened to Maya's story without interruption, his expression growing more serious as he understood the scope of what she had been facing alone. When she finished talking, his first words weren't judgment or advice, they were an apology. He told Maya he was sorry she had been carrying this burden by herself, sorry she had felt she had no choice but to run, and sorry the system had failed to protect both her and the young people she had been trying to help. But David also helped Maya see her situation from a different perspective. Her decision to leave Millbrook had been made with incomplete information and under extreme duress. She had been trying to protect people with no support and no good options. The fact that Marcus had proceeded with his plans after her departure didn't make her responsible for the consequences, it made Marcus's crimes more obvious and more serious. David suggested something Maya had been too afraid to consider, that it might be time to fight back rather than continue running. Marcus had clearly not been content to let Maya disappear quietly. He was actively harming the young people she cared about, and her continued absence was enabling him to operate without interference. Maya's professional knowledge and her relationship with the arrested teenagers could be crucial evidence in building a case against Marcus and his network. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Maya's life. David helped her work through the practical and emotional challenges of returning to confront the situation she had fled. He researched legal protections for whistleblowers, helped her contact advocacy organizations that supported people in similar situations, and even offered to accompany her back to Millbrook as moral support. But, most importantly, he helped Maya remember who she was underneath all the fear and trauma. Maya had spent so many weeks focused on survival that she had forgotten the strength and competence that had defined her professional life. She was not just a victim of Marcus's manipulation, she was also an experienced advocate for vulnerable populations, someone who understood both the system and the people caught within it. The teenagers who had been arrested needed someone who understood their situations and could help them navigate the legal and social services systems. Maya was uniquely qualified to be that person. The decision to return to Millbrook was terrifying, but it also felt like the first choice Maya had made in months that aligned with her values rather than her fears. David helped her prepare for the practical challenges of going back, finding legal representation, securing safe housing, developing a plan for reconnecting with her former colleagues and clients. But he also helped her prepare emotionally for facing Marcus and the wreckage of her former life. On a cold morning in mid-February, Maya and David drove back toward Millbrook together. Maya felt simultaneously nauseated with fear and energized by purpose. She had no idea what kind of reception awaited her or whether she would be able to make a difference in the lives of the teenagers who had been arrested. But, for the first time since that terrible night with Marcus, Maya felt like herself again, not the frightened woman who had been running from an impossible situation, but the advocate who had dedicated her career to protecting young people who couldn't protect themselves. As they approached the city limits of Millbrook, David pulled over at a rest stop so Maya could collect herself before facing whatever came next. He reminded her that she didn't have to do this alone, that he would be there to support her through whatever happened, and that her decision to come back was an act of courage that honored both her own values and her commitment to the young people she served. Maya looked at this man who had offered her sanctuary when she needed it most, who had helped her find her way back to herself, and realized that sometimes the most important journeys begin with accepting help from a stranger who chooses to see your worth when you can no longer see it yourself.